Hello everyone, welcome to Knitter Matters. Unbelievably, this is episode 11. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Cheryl Lampard, I'm an image consultant, my company is Style Matters International, and for as long as I can remember I've had two passions, which are sewing and knitting. And knitting in particular is one of those things that I find extremely therapeutic and calming. And when we all went into quarantine 11 weeks ago now, I decided it might be a nice thing to try and teach people how to knit, and it seems you really like that. So it's my pleasure to teach you. I used to also own a yarn store in Brighton, England, and so that love of knitting never goes away. Now, Knitter Matters, as I said, we're on 11 weeks we started this, and thanks to you, you seem to like it. So keep telling us that, and that's wonderful. But we also now have our own YouTube channel. Thank you if you have already subscribed to it, but if you haven't, it would be fantastic if you would, because once we get 100 subscribers, we get our own unique URL, which apparently is a very good thing to have. So all you need to do is go onto YouTube and then search for Knitter Matters and then hit the subscribe button. That would be wonderful if you would do that. We're also on Instagram, and feel free on this Facebook page to post any comments or anything related to knitting. I'm here to help, and I'll be pleased to answer those things for you. And if you're new today, welcome, special welcome to you. Put it in the comment box where you're from. It's always nice to know where people are from. I can't see any comments you're putting in today, but I promise to get back to you afterwards. Now, just hold tight, because we're going to hold steady for this bumpy ride as we turn the camera around to what we're all here for. Just take my glasses off too. Okay, so last week we started our sampler Afghan. We're going to go on to that again in a minute, but before I do that, I have some technical tips that I want to share with you. I think we're going to call this part of Knitter Matters Technical Tuesday. So I had a question from a lady about markers, where you place markers. Often patterns will tell you to place markers, and on your abbreviation sheet here, this basic sheet, it's PM. You'll see it says PM, place marker. If you want a copy of this, just let me know and I'll put it in the comments page, and then you can print it off. So markers come in a couple of shapes and sizes really. There's little ring markers like this, some nice coloured ones here, little circles, you can get large and small ones, and there's markers like this. You can't really see these so well, these are some new ones that I just got, but they're pretty much the colour of the knitting below it, but they're really like sort of little light bulb shaped safety pins almost. There's those, and there's these, which are the same type of thing. So when do you use the different types of markers? Well, in this piece that I have knitted, the back of this sweater, I have used these markers up the sides to tell me certain increases, when I need to do certain increases in the shape or decreases. And I've also used them here that's actually just a marker to tell me when I do the front, where I want to start shaping for the neck and shaping for the back neck. Well, these pop out, you can put them in, pop out. So you can move them about. But the important thing to remember, if you're using these little chaps, and they're very nice they are too, but these are the sort of markers that you actually place in your knitting. So let me explain to you what I mean. So let's say you had a really wide piece of knitting with something like 200 stitches and a pattern that maybe has, a 28 stitch repeat. I'm just making that as I go along. These markers are really handy to place where you are indicating a certain amount of stitches. So you could place them every 50 stitches, so that if you have to count up the rows every so often, or the stitches that you're casting on maybe, or the first couple of rows, you know where your 50 stitches are. But here's the thing with these, you have to move them every time you knit a row. Otherwise, you're going to knit them into the fabric of your piece of knitting. So these markers are great when you need to move them. They're temporary markers really, but you can't keep them in the same way that you can these. So it's different markers for different things, okay? I will come back to that in a moment. Something else. The other thing, oh, I do need that now actually. The other thing I want to show you, and this is something that happens whether you're a beginner knitter or not. It's not the end of the world, but what happens when you bind off? Often you get this really kind of loose, ugly stitch. I've actually pulled that out a bit more than it needs to be, just to show you. But when you're binding off, sometimes the last stitch you get this. Sometimes you get a loose stitch at the start of the row. That's not so much of an issue because you can actually tug the yarn a bit, and there's different ways of dealing with that. But this one, it's ugly. Now, is it the end of the world? No, it's not. And I would normally just weave that in, but it might bother you. And if it's a part of knitting which is going to be seen on an edge, you certainly don't want that. What you want is something that looks a bit more like this, where we've lost that ugly big loop. I'll put it on the black so you can kind of see the difference there. There's this ugly stitch here, and that's much neater. And it really is a very simple fix, and I'm going to show you how you deal with that. So I'll take this piece of knitting. I'm going to swivel round a little bit so the camera can see. I'm just going to unpick my stitches. By the way, when you unpick stitch by stitch, that's called tinking. And if you think about it, that spells knit backwards. Tink is knit backwards. So I'm just going to tink back. All I'm doing is undoing it. So I'm now going to bind off this row. And I'll show you what to do right at the end. Just got to adjust myself a bit here. I'm hoping you can see. So I would normally, I'm doing my bind off where I knit, I bind off. You just have to bear with me while I do this to the end of the row. And I promise you, this is a really simple fix. I hate that ugly loose stitch, and it happens. It's not a case of just being a beginner. And the reason it happens is because you've actually got no tension on that last stitch. When I'm knitting like this, the very fact that I'm going into the next stitch, I'm knitting it, I'm pulling over, I've got some tension that's sort of controlling the stitches. When I get to the last couple of stitches, and certainly that last one, I don't have anything to hold it down. So I'm gonna just stop here. So I need to bind off these last two stitches. What I'm going to do is just slip them onto my right hand needle for a moment, and then I want you to find the stitch below it. So I want to go into the left hand side, the left leg of the stitch below the one I've just knitted. Okay, I'm going to put that now on my needle. Okay, so I've got two stitches there essentially. I'm going to put them back on the left needle because I need to knit those. I'm going to do my cast off here, my bind off here. I'm going to knit these two together and bind off. And then I will show you how neat that looks. Oh. It's much neater, and it doesn't affect your knitting in any other way except making it neater. If I could just pull that out without splitting my yarn. Oh dear, okay. Let me just ease that out, sorry. I'm trying to pull that through and I've split the yarn, but that's okay. There's always a way around it. Here we go. I still kind of just hold the needle in and pull it down, fasten it off a bit, and you see that's so much neater. So much neater. And of course you'll do it much better than I am because you're not sitting sideways trying to show it. But let me show you the big ugly one again, and you'll see the difference. That's our big ugly loop. And now we don't have a big ugly loop. That stitch is a bit ugly, but I should have pulled that in a bit better. But you see, we've lost that now. Okay? But that's the technique to get rid of that. Okay. Let's now go on to our sampler Afghan. So just to recap, we're using this Mary Maxim pattern. It's called the sampler Afghan. And they very kindly, Mary Maxim very kindly has given this to Knit and Matters as a free download. I did publish the link to it last week, and I will publish the link to it again afterwards. So this is what we're following. And to just recap what we're doing, get that out of the way, is essentially it's an Afghan of 6 strips. You're knitting 7 different patterned squares in 6 strips. It's a total of 42 squares overall, and each strip is going to be sewn up vertically afterwards. However, you can knit them as separate squares, which is what I have been doing, because you might not want a whole Afghan. You might just want to practice your stitches. You might want to turn it into a little cushion cover or something like that. So I'm doing it in squares. And now a question did arise on the pattern, on the actual instructions for the pattern. If you're knitting in strips, this only applies if you're knitting in strips, where you change either colour or stitch pattern. Sometimes you're asked to decrease stitches evenly across the last row. And the question I was asked was, if you're knitting in squares, do you need to make those decreases? And it's a very good question. And the answer is really you don't, because the only reason those decreases are there is because certain of the pattern squares have a different stitch count. Let me show you what we did last week. So last week we did this large lattice pattern. We did this large lattice pattern, and this one has 37 stitches. I blocked them out again so that you could see the patterns more clearly. This one we also did last week, and it's the cross cables pattern. That was actually worked over 38 stitches. Now that's only 1 stitch different, but some of the designs go down to 34 stitches, some go up to 38, so that's quite a lot. So the question you might be asking is, well, how can the squares be the same size? Because these squares are basically 7 inches, 7 inches each side, approximately 7 inches. So how can, with the same needle size and the same yarn, how can the squares come out differently? Well, this is why, because you're doing different designs, and whenever you have something like a tighter design, and certainly cables bring the design in a little bit, you're probably going to need more stitches than a lacier design, which is much more open. So this lacy or this large lattice pattern, you've got lots of holes or eyelets. So that actually creates, it's almost like a sort of lace knitting. So you're creating a bigger piece of work than you are with something tighter. In a much earlier episode, I showed you the different ribbing techniques, and you could see a sample of how ribbing pulls in the knitting as opposed to stocking stitch. So that's why. So the answer is no, you don't have to decrease or increase if you are doing squares. I actually tried it with my squares. A couple of them, I did keep the decrease on this lattice one. I did a decrease on my last row, and I kept it in because it just pulled it in slightly. But honestly, you really don't need to. It only really applies if you're knitting the strips. Put this out of the way. So this week, we're going to look at 2 other pattern stitches. This one is a diamond pattern, and this is again a perfect example how your stitches on this one, this is worked over 35 stitches, and because you're doing a lot of yarn overs, we did that in our lacy knitting class, you're creating these eyelets, you're creating these holes. You're also, when you do a yarn over, you're making a stitch, so you're keeping the stitch count even on all of these rows, because you're doing either a pass slip stitch over or a knit two together. So you get these nice sort of traveling lines for this diamond pattern. The knit two togethers are going that way, the pass slip stitch over are going this way. I'm not going to show you how to knit this one, because you know everything we've done in this pattern, on this particular pattern square, it's worked over 35 stitches. It's a 12 row repeat. It's a 12 row repeat. Sorry, I get that so you can see it better. And just to remind you, these patterns, as I said last week, are generally a 42 or a 44 row pattern. So how does that work when you've got just 12 rows to this pattern? This is a 12 row repeat. Well, the pattern instructions themselves tell you, but it's very simple. On this one, you're just repeating this 12 rows twice more, so that brings you to 36, and then you do 6 more rows, and that has you finish on a row 6. The pattern tells you that. So just because it's less than 42 or 44 rows, it doesn't mean to say you're not going to get the right pattern design that you want. You just have to watch what the pattern says. So that one is just a repeat. So I'm not going to show you how to knit that one, because you know everything how to do, you know all the stitches in that one. I am going to show you some new stitches on this one. This, I think, is possibly the most complicated square in the Afghan pattern. It is called the lacy cables pattern. And what we have here, we have a selection of cables, right leaning cables, left leaning cables, cables that go both directions up in the middle. We have just about everything in here. We have eyelets, we have creating these little patterns that go up the side, and then it changes in the middle. So you start doing cables and this eyelet pattern, and then you start doing the pattern where you think, I've gone wrong here. So just stay with it. It is a bit disconcerting at first, because you think, well, I should be doing a cable here, but the pattern changes in the middle. It's a very pretty pattern, but don't be afraid of it. You've got these nice kind of curly, wavy little stitch patterns there, and the cable. So there's just about everything there. But the two stitches that you're going to be doing differently, one is a cable stitch. It's not a different, it's just a different combination of stitches for the cable, different amount that you're doing than you might normally do, and you're doing a yarn round needle. Now, when you see YRN, that means yarn round needle, but how does that differ to a yarn over? It's actually the same thing, but it really depends on where your yarn is and whether the next stitch is a purl or a knit, or the previous stitch has been that. Let me show you. And I'm going to work from pattern from line number 9. So I'm going to use my handy dandy tool here on pattern row 9. Let me show you. We're also going to be doing the cables here, so I'll get hold of my cable needle. A lot going on here. I'm going to move that out the way and bring that in when we need to. Okay, so row 9, I need to purl 2. I chose this row because it's got everything you need to learn the new stitches. Hopefully you can see me okay. Yeah, okay. I'm just checking over my shoulder to the camera. So we're doing a purl 2. We're doing a knit 3. Doing a knit 3. We're doing a purl 2. Now, we're doing something here called a C5B. If I look here at my first sheet of my pattern, special abbreviations this comes under. So my C5, what does it say? C5B, cable 5 back. And it says quite clearly you slip the next 3 stitches. This is a bit of an uneven cable. The cables we've done in the past, it's usually 3 stitches on the needle, 3 stitches on the cable needle. This one tells you to slip 3 onto the cable needle. I'll get the pattern instruction out of the way in a second. Get 3 onto the cable needle and hold to the back. So the C5B, cable 5 back, you take the 3, you hold them to the back. You then knit the 2, this is a 5 stitch cable. You then knit those 2 from the left hand needle, and then you knit these 3. So you haven't gone wrong if you think, oh my goodness, I've got 3 and 2. You've actually got what you should have. So that's my cable 5 back. I'm bringing my pattern back now so I know what to do next. The next bit is in brackets. Purl 1, yarn over, slip 1, knit 1, purl, slip, stitch over. You know how to do that. Somebody asked a question also about how to instructions within asterisks and brackets differ. They're basically the same thing. When you've got pattern instructions that are asterisks, it's telling you to do that probably until the end of the row. When you've got it in brackets, it's basically the same thing. You're repeating it, but you're repeating it for a given amount. So here, this instruction in the parenthesis, or it might be round, I'm wrapping it round the needle. The result is the same. Okay, I can see we're back on. Let me show you again. The next stitch, purl 1, I've done my purl 1, yarn over needle. So this is exactly as you've done before. It's literally going over the needle. I'm going slip 1, knit 1, purl, slip, stitch over. You know how to do that. Then we're doing purl 1. I have to do a knit 2 together here. Knit 2 together. Now this is the yarn round needle. Let's get that out of the way so you can see it. All I'm doing, and this is important because your next stitch is a purl stitch. I can't possibly do a yarn over. I can't bring it that way over. I can only do really a yarn over when my next stitch is a knit stitch. So I bring this round and wrap it. I literally wrap it round the needle. I'll show you that again. That's where it is. I need to bring it round and then wrap. Whoops, wrap round the needle. Now I can do my purl. Now I have to do my cable 5F, that means cable 5 front. In this instance, I'm slipping 2 stitches onto my cable knit, 2 stitches, not 3, and I'm holding it at the front of the work. Now I'm going to knit my cable 3 that way, and then the 2 off the cable needle. And you can either knit them straight off the cable needle or off the needle, whichever is you're more comfortable with. Remember, it's 2. So I've got a left-leaning cable now. Now, to finish my row, I have to do purl 2, knit 3. And this seems a bit odd too, because you're changing the pattern here. You think, well, I did knits there, and you're doing purl. Trust me, just follow the pattern on this one. It does work. Okay. So that's the only difference with our yarn overs and yarn round needles. It really depends on the stitch, where the yarn has been left from the previous stitch and what the next stitch is. But the result is the same. You get an eyelet, you get a hole. Okay, so I'm going to ask the camera to just come back to me. That's our lesson for today. I'm sorry about that technical hitch. If we need to, well, we record it. I'll have a look at it and see how bad it was. Sorry, nothing we could do about that. But I love technology when it works. Not so good when it doesn't, but okay, it's live, so that happens. So I hope today has been enjoyable for you. I hope you've learned some new things, some new tips and tricks. Wonderful if you have. Next week, keep knitting your squares or your strips, because next week I'll be showing you some different ways of sewing up the strips or the squares. So that's going to be exciting. In the meantime, let me know if you have any questions, any points you want to make about knitting. I'm happy to answer them all. Please let me know. So don't get stressed about anything. I'm here to help. So in the meantime, stay well, stay calm, stay at home if we still have to, and keep knitting. And I will see you next Tuesday again. Thank you so much for joining me today. See you next week for episode 12. Bye for now.